Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final session in our course called Between the Testaments. Over the past three sessions, we've been tracing the story of God's people from the close of the Old Testament prophets around 440 BC all the way to the manger in Bethlehem. We've watched empires rise and fall, seen the Jewish people scattered throughout the entire Mediterranean world, witnessed the monumental translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, and traced the dramatic story of how those same scriptures were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In this session, then, we turn our attention to religious developments that shaped the Jewish culture in which the New Testament was written. To understand this context, we need to begin with a crisis that took place more than 160 years before Jesus is born. A crisis caused by Antiochus IV Epiphanes and something called the Abomination of Desolation. In many ways, this is the darkest chapter in the entire intertestamental period. Yet it is also one of the most important for understanding God's faithfulness. The villain in the story is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 to 164 BC. The bust you see on the screen is the very face that stared down at the Jewish people with contempt. He seized power while the rightful heir, Demetrius I, was held hostage in Rome. He wasn't supposed to be king, and he knew it. So he ruled with the insecurity of an illegitimate ruler, which made him very dangerous. Antiochus pursued a policy of forced Hellenization. He compelled his Jewish subjects to embrace Greek culture, including its language, athletics, philosophy, and religion. To him, the strange Jewish laws about food, circumcision, and exclusive worship of one invisible God were an embarrassing relic. He decided to modernize them, whether they liked it or not. Earlier in the course, we mentioned that the biblical prophet Daniel foresaw ongoing struggles between the kings of the south, which is the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, and the kings of the north, the Seleucid kingdom in the area we now know as Syria. He saw these events in cryptic form some 450 years before they occurred. We have a record of these visions in chapter 11 of the book of Daniel. Let's take a moment to look at some of the visions that seem to point directly to Antiochus. Daniel 11:21, for example, says that a contemptible person will succeed the king of the north, one who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue, unquote. In 175 BC, this is exactly how Antiochus becomes the new Seleucid emperor, seizing power while the rightful heir to the throne, Demetrius I, is held hostage in Rome. Then in verse 22 we read, "Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him, both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed." Well, historically, when Antiochus seizes the throne, he quickly removes the rightful high priest, Onias III, and installs his compliant brother Jason. Then Onias is murdered 4 years later in 171 BC, effectively destroying a prince of the covenant. In verses 25 and 26, Daniel describes renewed hostilities between the north and the south. Eventually, the king of the north will prove victorious. The king of the south will fail because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. And this is exactly what happened in 170 to 169 BC. Antiochus attacked Egypt and laid siege to Alexandria. Eventually, new regents of the young Ptolemy VI overcame the previous regents and sued for peace. In verse 27, Daniel foresees that the two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other. It turns out that Antiochus actually took Ptolemy VI prisoner, where the two could sit down face to face. And I think we can safely assume that a bit of lying took place when they negotiated the terms of peace. After this, in verse 28, Daniel records that the king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. Again, this tracks with history. After Antiochus defeated his southern rival, he returned to his kingdom, emboldened to crush any rebellion to his Hellenistic policies. In 169 BC, he entered Judea, raided Jerusalem, and plundered the temple. Then, in verses 29 to 30, Daniel foresees that the king of the north will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. In 169 BC, Antiochus does indeed invade Egyptian territories again, but this time Rome sends ships of Kittim, or ships of the western coastlands. The Roman envoy, Popilius Laenas, draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus and says, "Decide before you step out." And Antiochus backs down humiliated. He is now a cornered and furious man. The level of detail here in the scriptural record is indeed remarkable. The detail is in fact so precise that many modern biblical interpreters insist that these visions must have been written later, after these events had already happened. However, I take the more traditional view that God revealed these visions to the historical prophet Daniel some 450 years before these events occurred. I think God provides this abundance of detail for a reason. He is building this story to a climax, which is really a crisis, one of the most pivotal moments in the entire intertestamental period. And he wants his people to recognize this sign when those events occur. In Daniel 11:31, we read this comment about the king of the north. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. They will set up the abomination that causes desolation. In 168 or 167 BC, Antiochus IV Epiphanes does in fact desecrate the temple. He sets up an altar to Zeus in the holy place, sacrifices pigs on the altar of burnt offering, forces Jewish people to eat pork, and participate in foreign religious festivals. The Deuterocanonical book, 1st Maccabees, was written some 60 years after these events, around 100 BC. In that account, we read these words, "And the king wrote unto his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that everyone should give up his religious usages. And all the nations acquiesced in accordance with the command of the king, and many in Israel took delight in his form of worship, and they began sacrificing to idols and profaned the Sabbath." A bit later in that same account, the author further explains, "And on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they set up upon the altar an abomination of desolation. And in the cities of Judah on every side, they established high places. And they offered sacrifices at the doors of the houses and in the streets." Remember, this was prohibited under Jewish law. Now, according to our modern dating system, this describes December the 7th, 168 or 167 BC, depending on whether Syrian or Babylonian calculations are used. This tragic event was now permanently seared into Jewish hearts and minds. A little over 100 years later, Jesus referenced it as a clear warning to the people of his day. "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." At the time, the people could hardly have realized that more abomination and desolation were on their way. Tragedies even more shocking and destructive were imminent. The Holy One who embodied the high priesthood, the king, the sacrifice, and the temple itself would be nailed to a cursed tree. And within just a few decades, the Romans would totally raze to the ground the temple that Antiochus desecrated. This Roman abomination truly does cause desolation. Between these events, however, between Antiochus and Jesus, God still had plans for this second temple. The emperor's offensive action galvanized a highly offended sector of the Jewish population. Let's take a look then at their firm response. God's chosen vessels for this response came through a family line known as the Maccabees. Now, we've already heard this name mentioned in earlier sessions. Two books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, often appear within lists of deuterocanonical works. This family line continued to play a major role in Jewish history well into the Roman period. The founding father of this line was Mattathias, a priest from Modin, a town located in the Judean foothills some 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Mattathias initiated the revolt against the Seleucid Empire when a royal agent tried to force him to sacrifice to Zeus. Mattathias refused and killed the agent, and he also killed a Jewish worshiper who was ready and willing to compromise his own faith and bow down to an idol. He then boldly issued a rallying cry: "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." At this point, he and his 5 sons fled to the hills to lead the revolt. Mattathias died within a year of natural causes, but in the meantime, he passed his leadership on to his sons. His 3rd son, Judas Maccabeus, called the Hammer, took charge of the military efforts. He became known for guerrilla warfare, brilliant ambushes, and an unshakable commitment to Torah. Against overwhelming odds, Judas won stunning victories. By 164 BC, he had recaptured Jerusalem. Exactly 3 years after its desecration, the Maccabees led services to cleanse and rededicate the temple. The book of 1st Maccabees recalls the event this way: "At the corresponding time of the month and on the corresponding day on which the Gentiles had profaned it, on that day was it dedicated afresh with songs and harps and lutes and with cymbals. And all the people fell upon their faces and worshipped and gave praise, looking up unto heaven to him who had prospered them. And they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and offered burnt offerings with gladness and sacrificed a sacrifice of deliverance and praise." To this day, Jewish people recall this celebratory event in a festival of dedication we know as Hanukkah. It is an 8-day celebration that recalls God's historic work of deliverance. The 9-branched menorah associated with this festival retells a later Jewish tradition. When the Jewish leaders went into the recaptured temple to relight its ceremonial lamp, they found only 1 day's worth of ritually pure oil. Miraculously, however, that 1 day's supply burned for 8 full days until new oil could be pressed in accordance with established Jewish law. The 9th candle, the shamash or the servant candle, lights all the others. Each year, Jewish worshippers light the menorah to remind themselves and one another that God's light cannot be extinguished by tyrants. Interestingly, the Gospel of John refers to this festival in chapter 10, verse 22. Jesus himself was celebrating the feast, and right there in these same temple courts, he proclaimed, "I and the Father are one." The very place that had once been desecrated, where the light of God's blessing was extinguished, was now the place where the true light of the world stood. After the dedication, the Maccabees were able to establish a brief period of relative calm. Jonathan, Aphas, and then Simon successfully negotiated political alliances with the Seleucids, and even Rome gave them some breathing room. Soon, however, the fragile nature of this peace would become evident. Here the story starts to take another tragic turn. Simon Maccabeus, the last surviving son of Mattathias, was declared by what is called a Great Assembly in 141 BC to be leader and high priest forever, until a faithful prophet should arise. In this statement, however, we see a sacred line which every Jewish leader from this period would now be tempted to cross. While they waited for God to reveal a new prophet, would priests now step into the role? Were they now the true prophetic leaders of God's people, like Moses himself? When Simon Maccabeus was assassinated, his son John Hyrcanus assumed the role of high priest. Soon, however, he proved he was more than willing to cross that traditional sacred line, and he began to merge the roles of religious and political leadership. He negotiated treaties, led armies, and expanded the kingdom. He implemented his own version of forced religious compliance, when he required conquered Idumeans from the former Edom to accept Jewish customs, including the rite of circumcision. This decision left a permanent rift in the population, especially when an Idumean by the name of Herod was eventually named king of Judea. Later Jewish literature refers to Hyrcanus as prince or ethnarch, as well as high priest. His son Aristobulus I, however, apparently removed all pretense. Josephus maintains that he was the first Jewish leader from this period to explicitly embrace the title of king. This makes him the first ruler of what became known as the Hasmonean dynasty, perhaps named after legendary ancestors in the Maccabean line. If Josephus is correct, by accepting the title of king, Aristobulus had fully blurred the lines between priest and king, and the consequences would be devastating. For some, this represented a religious and theological problem. The Hasmoneans were Levites, not from the tribe of Judah. According to Jacob's blessing recorded in the book of Genesis, the scepter was supposed to belong to Judah. And God later made a solemn promise to King David, who is indeed from the line of Judah, saying that your throne will be established forever. And alongside these specific biblical arguments, there was a long tradition of Mosaic law that separated the sacredness of the Levitical priestly office from common mundane affairs. Many Jewish people of the day would have found it difficult to condone a high priest acting as a king, blurring the line between the sacred and profane world. In the New Testament, of course, God himself erases this line when he reveals Jesus as the fulfillment of prophet, priest, and king. At this earlier stage in the process, however, Aristobulus and his successors would have had a difficult time holding these two lines of authority together. Later, critics and opponents would use these revelations to oppose Hasmonean rule. It would in fact be a different king from a different family line that takes center stage in the next stage of God's plan. So let's turn to that part of the story. Internal struggles over Hasmonean rule eventually attracted the attention of Rome, who would not tolerate any disruption in the flow of goods and tribute from their client territories. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey the Great brought his armies to Judea and besieged Jerusalem. And after the Jewish surrender, he entered the temple and even walked into the Holy of Holies. Again, the sacred space of Judaism was unthinkably violated. Again, this once mighty nation of God was humiliated. Judea became just another Roman client state. The cultural and spiritual impact was profound. The Jewish throne was now a Roman appointment. The temple had been turned into a battlefield. Independence was once again only a nostalgic memory and a distant hope. Once more, the people felt the oppressive weight of divine judgment. To oversee Roman interests, Mark Antony and the Roman Senate appointed an Idumean or Edomite by birth, who had no legitimate Jewish claim to the throne. When the Parthians installed the last Hasmonean king, Herod fled to Rome, convinced the Senate to declare him king of the Jews, and with Roman legions recaptured Jerusalem in 37 BC. He murdered the Hasmonean high priest Aristobulus III. As an Idumean client king, Herod faced deep Jewish distrust. He ruthlessly eliminated rivals, including Hasmonean leaders and even his own wife and her sons. Nevertheless, through his unwavering loyalty to Rome, he was able to hold power and even to expand Judean territory. To magnify his own glory, and perhaps to a lesser extent to pacify his Jewish subjects, Herod undertook massive building campaigns in the region, including a huge renovation and expansion of the Temple Mount. For some 80 plus years, beginning around 20 or 19 BC, and continuing well after Herod's death, workers entirely transformed the Second Temple, originally built by Jewish exiles some 500 years earlier. In the first year and a half, the sanctuary was finished with gold and white marble. Within 8 years, workers completed the temple courts and the walls surrounding them. But then the real work began. The entire footprint of the Temple Mount was expanded with huge retaining walls filled with massive amounts of material. Some of the stones used in these walls were some 40 feet long and weighed some 80 tons. This work would take some additional 70 years to complete, finishing sometime in 63 or 64 AD. It is no wonder then that the disciples would eventually point to this rebuilt temple with a sense of cultural pride. Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. We can likewise understand their surprise when Jesus replies in the following verse, "Not one stone here will be left on another." After that massive 80-year project was completed, the structure barely survived for another 7 years until the Romans came and destroyed it again. And to this day, it has not been rebuilt. While all this political drama unfolded, the religious landscape was also transforming. In previous sessions, we covered some of this change, the expanding diaspora of Jewish exiles across the empire, the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures known as the Septuagint, and the preservation of manuscripts known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we should also take a look at a couple other factors that significantly shaped the Jewish culture in which both Jesus and the New Testament church lived. One of these factors was the growing role of the synagogue. Remember, in that day, there was only one Jewish temple, and it was in Jerusalem. All sacrifices and required annual offerings had to be completed within its courts. Outside of Jerusalem, among the worshiping exiles scattered throughout the empire, the synagogue became the center of community life and worship. Every Sabbath, Torah was read, prayers were offered, and instruction was given. As a result of these new growing religious centers, the roles of scribes and teachers also rose in prominence, alongside the traditional role of priests who still ministered at the temple in Jerusalem. This growth in turn helped pave the way for the future spread of the gospel. The teaching at these synagogues provided a wider familiarity with the stories of Scripture on which the gospel message was based. They also provided a starting point for early Jewish followers of Jesus to advance his message within these local communities. And of course, they especially provided the Apostle Paul as a credentialed scribe and teacher with local entry points for his missionary efforts. Within this growing number of synagogues, however, people also began to encounter a growing diversity of Jewish thought and practice. Several forms of Judaism appeared by the time we reached the birth of Jesus around 4 BC. So let's take a look at a few of these emerging movements. First, the Pharisees, a lay movement passionate about holiness. They accepted both the written Torah and the oral tradition that had grown up around it. They believed in resurrection, angels, and final judgment. And in many ways, they were the spiritual ancestors of rabbinic Judaism. Jesus clashed with them most fiercely, not because they were too strict or too obsessed with holiness, but because their traditions sometimes radically misinterpreted the Word of God. Yet many Pharisees, like Nicodemus and later Paul, became followers of Jesus. The Sadducees were the aristocratic priestly elite who controlled the temple. They accepted only the 5 books of Moses as God's written law. They rejected beliefs in resurrection or angels. And to keep their local governing authority, they were often politically cooperative with Rome. At one illustrative point, Paul highlighted some differences between Pharisees and Sadducees. When he stood before the Sanhedrin, he pitted one against another by announcing, "I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." And of course, this started an argument that allowed him to escape. The Sadducees largely disappeared after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, leaving rabbinic Judaism to rise into prominence. Then we have a group who are sometimes called the Essenes, but as we learned in our last session, they are frequently identified with the Qumran community who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. They viewed the Jerusalem temple leadership as hopelessly corrupt. They withdrew to the desert, practiced rigorous purity, copied scrolls, and waited for 2 messiahs, one priestly, one royal. Their apocalyptic worldview prepared the hearts of many to hear John the Baptist's call to repent. In contrast with this more separatist group, we have the Zealots. They carried on the rebellious traditions of the early Maccabees. They believed foreign rule was an affront to God's kingship, and they were ready to take up arms. You may recall that one of the 12 disciples of Jesus was called Simon the Zealot. The same passion that made them dangerous revolutionaries also made some of them radical disciples. In addition to these more specialized forms of Judaism, we can identify a much larger group of Jewish worshippers who participated in what we might call common Judaism. They were the farmers, fishermen, carpenters, and mothers who loved the temple, kept the feast, circumcised their sons, observed Sabbath and food laws, and longed for the day when God would visit his people again. Having provided this brief overview of the rise of the synagogue, along with these various forms of Judaism, we can begin to see God's hand at work. He was preparing the way for Jesus to address a wide range of views and propose solutions. Each in their own way, faithful Jewish worshippers were looking for answers, looking for God to keep his promises, waiting for him to act. Jesus enters the world. He meets a people of God who were used to hearing new ideas, even if they did not always accept or appreciate them. But for those who were ready to listen, God had an answer that satisfied their deepest questions. So what's the point? I think it's simply this, that by the time Jesus was born, God had ensured that both the religious and national life of Israel was ready for a new phase in his plan, led by a new sort of king and a new type of priest. Think about it. A temple grander than Solomon's stood in Jerusalem, ready for the Messiah to cleanse it and declare himself its Lord. A network of synagogues covered the Roman world, ready for the gospel to be preached, beginning in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. A longing for a faithful prophet, ready to recognize John the Baptist and then the prophet greater than Moses. Sectarian division and spiritual hunger, ready for a Messiah who would tear down dividing walls and create one new people in himself. I hope then that we have convincingly made our case that God was not really silent in this period between the Testaments. He was, in fact, preparing the world for the next stage in his redemptive plan. Thank you for walking with me through this extraordinary journey. I pray that the Lord blesses you for your faithful listening. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you on Sunday.